This video is for the therapists, for the men that walk into your office. The adult men who are there on their own. It's a crisis. It's an emergency. You are not the first line of defense. You are the last line of defense. All right, I'll be back probably every few months to make a similar sort of reminder, and I'm going to keep saying it until it ends up not being true, or until I am confident that all therapists are treating this with the sort of urgency that is required.
I truly appreciate this person making her video calling out the reality of what's going on in mental therapy. It's long overdue that we address the elephant in the room, as it were, that the mental health profession, the ones who are in theory supposed to be helping people who are broken, is itself broken. Broken to the point it's becoming, some would already say, is unsafe for men. The fact of the matter is, the overwhelming majority of today's mental health professionals are women, and those numbers are only getting worse. As I'm filming this, about 3/4 of all mental health professionals are in fact women. But even more startling is when you look at the breakdown of therapists under 30 and those who are in school training to become therapists. Because when you look at that percentage, well, it jumps to 90% in some areas. 90%. Compounding it, it's not just about who they are teaching, but what they are teaching them in these schools. The fact is, the schools over the past few decades have been churning out therapists, largely female, who are predisposed to blame men for all of society's ills. They've been taught the Me Too doctrine, which is to believe all women, which then in turn leads to not believing any man. Not now, not ever. I can't tell you the number of men who've shared their stories with me about how they sought out therapy for things like domestic violence they've suffered or marriage counseling, only to be castigated and blamed for what happened to them. Man after man has related to me how he's actually gotten up and walked out of these sessions because it wasn't about healing, wasn't about facing their trauma, but an exercise in blaming them for whatever happened to them. They relay how the therapists haven't listened to them, but lectured them. And let's be clear about something. You're never going to find that showing up in the reporting or data. Oh no, my friends. The last thing the mental health profession ever wants to do is hold its members accountable for what they're doing to patients. We hear all the time about the so-called blue wall when it comes to police. Well, the paneled wall, as I like to call it, of the mental health profession is like a double reinforced concrete pillbox when compared to that blue wall. Now, to be clear, I'm not talking about legitimate psychotherapy where they hold people accountable. Those are discussions that need to take place. They need to be making sure that people take responsibility for their actions so that they can bring about change in their lives. I fully agree that is a necessary component. However, it's no longer about that. What it's become is literally attacking men who come to them for help, blaming men in general, the patriarchy, and anything and everything else they can think of. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't get contacted by men who've experienced just that when seeking out help. And yet we wonder, why don't men seek out help? Especially from those who are in theory supposed to be the experts in the field and who should be able to provide the most caring, concern, and compassion. It's truly sad, and it begs the question, why? Why is it that the mental health profession has become so toxic against men? Why is it these so-called experts see men and mistreat them when they come to them for help? Why is it there are so few men's mental health professionals? And why is it the schools aren't trying to recruit men into the field anymore? The answer, by the way, to those last two is because they don't want men in the field. And those that do enter it are largely reporting they're being mistreated themselves by their peers. And the biggest question of all, the one that so many men that I talk to experience, is why don't they acknowledge that men have very real, very deep issues that in most cases, I'd argue, aren't all that different to those that women face? And why don't they create therapies that can actually help those men? Why don't they teach these therapists to actually listen to men in a way that works for men, let alone treat them? Why do they instead teach them to, in a nutshell, victim blame those men? The answer is quite simple, and it's not just me saying it. It's actual therapists in the field that I've spoken to and interviewed, the ones that don't conform to the current blame men for their trauma paradigm. They're the ones saying it. The reason, quite simple, is that it doesn't conform to the agenda. The agenda that permeates not just in classes for mental health professionals, but all of academia. The agenda that believes and teaches that men are inherently bad simply because they're men, and thus aren't worthy of treatment, caring, concern, or compassion. In fact, it's just the opposite. It teaches them that men should be mistreated because, well, they're men. And that's actually what is happening. As I said, I hear stories from men all the time, men who've been abused. Yes, abused in therapy by actual therapists. Sadly, the truth is these days, when men seek out therapy for their trauma or issues, they're more likely to end up being blamed by the therapist than treated. Not just for their trauma, but everyone else's, especially the trauma that women face. It's not about helping the man to heal anymore, but making sure he knows he's to blame for whatever it is the therapist wants to blame him for. And again, we're not talking about legitimate therapeutic accountability. What we're talking about is therapists who are literally saying to men who are suffering and need help that it's their own fault, and thus they deserve whatever trauma or issue that they're dealing with. And that until they accept responsibility for things like their male privilege, for the so-called patriarchy and their role in it, and all the other feminist claptrap that has been instilled in these therapists, especially the younger female ones, who, as I said, make up 90% of the profession these days. Until they're willing to accept all that, these men can't possibly heal, according to the therapists. In some cases, I've had men tell me that when they dare to speak up against that agenda, or being blamed for whatever it is they're being blamed for, they were flat out told they weren't worthy of healing or help because they're not open to what needs to be done. Again, this is something I hear every single day, and no one, most certainly not academia or the mental health profession, wants to acknowledge it, let alone address it. If anything, they're working to hide it, to suppress the truth of what is going on and make sure that it doesn't get out. So again, kudos to this professional and all the others who are speaking up and at least trying to start a discussion, at least trying to hold their profession accountable. The courage it takes to do that cannot be understated, because I've seen what happens to those therapists who buck the system, how they are attacked, their credibility questioned. If only others would join in with them and actually do what their profession is supposed to do, which is show caring, concern, and compassion, and offering a helping hand to those who need it most. If they did, maybe, just maybe, we'd be able to start helping men rather than vilifying them. And maybe, just maybe, we'd be able to start addressing the fact that over 100 men each and every day, just in the United States, unalive themselves.